Wales. A land of myth and majesty, of legendary kings and warrior rebels. With more fortresses per square mile than anywhere else in the world. From the hills that put the stone in Stonehenge, to the secret hideaways where Led Zeppelin and Queen changed the history of rock. A country that forged its own destiny from the great monuments of its industrial past. A legacy celebrated in architecture, capturing the heart and the soul. Soar high above fairy tale castles, over rivers, and as close to the edge as you dare. Meet a people defined by poetry, song, and sport. A nation that bears the indelible marks of 2,000 years of invasion, but never once lost its identity. This is Wales, as you've never seen it before. The size of New Jersey, with a population of just 3 million people, Wales has always been fiercely proud of its autonomy. Simon Evans is originally from the southeast of England, but moved here with his family when he retired. This raised bank of earth close to the Welsh border runs near his home, and he and his son Tom walk here regularly. A few years ago, Simon trekked its entire length, a distance of around 177 miles. In fact, this is an ancient boundary between England and Wales, which follows long stretches of the current border between the two countries. It was constructed more than 1,200 years ago by the Anglo-Saxon King Offa to divide his territory from Wales. According to ancient tradition, the English would cut off the ears of any Welshman found to the east of Offa's Dyke, and the Welsh would hang every Englishman found to the west of it. Thankfully for these two Englishmen, the old traditions have lapsed. But the cultural significance of Offa's Dyke, like that of Hadrian's Wall on the Scottish border, is clear. Wales and England were, and always will be, separate places. The first ancestors of the Welsh arrived here 29,000 years ago, long before rising sea levels separated Britain from mainland Europe. Today, 2/3 of the population live in the valleys and towns of the south, including the country's largest city and its capital, Cardiff. In the 19th century, coal exported from South Wales fueled the furnaces and boilers of the world. The booming port of Cardiff attracted thousands of migrant workers. Back then, the neighbourhood of Tiger Bay was an infamous dockland quarter, home to the city's red light district. An unlikely location for this Lutheran church. But not to the Norwegian seafarers who settled here. In 1868, they built it as a place to meet and worship together. In recent years, the waterfront has become home to somewhat more imposing buildings, including this glass and steel edifice. It's the National Assembly, or Senedd in Welsh, home of the country's parliament. Nearby, the Millennium Centre, with its facade inscribed with the words of Welsh poet Gwyneth Lewis, is a venue for ballet, theatre, and the headquarters of the Welsh National Opera. Cardiff Castle was built by the Normans in 1081, 15 years after their king William the Conqueror invaded Britain from northern France. Constructed on the remains of a 3rd century Roman fort, this legacy of two major conquests was the seed from which the modern city grew. Though expanded and redeveloped many times, it remains an iconic feature of the Welsh capital. In the 1860s, this was the family home of the fabulously wealthy John Crichton Stuart. He hated growing up at the castle and later commissioned architect William Burgess to transform it in lavish Gothic revival style. Burgess added new towers, a roof garden, a sumptuous banqueting hall, and this magnificent 150-foot clock tower. During World War II, air raid shelters tunneled into the medieval walls protected 1,800 people. In 1947, after the death of Crichton's son, the family bequeathed the castle to the city of Cardiff. Close to the castle is the home ground and high church of Welsh Rugby, Cardiff's Principality Stadium. The arena, built from 56,000 tons of concrete and steel, can seat more than 74,000 supporters. Since 1999, it's hosted 3 World Cup tournaments. Rugby is Wales's national sport and a cherished part of its cultural identity. To compete here is the dream of every young Welsh player. Many pursue that dream at rugby clubs like this one, a few miles north of Cardiff in the town of Pontypridd. Rugby actually originated in northern England in the 1820s, but no one embraces it quite like the Welsh. There's hardly a town, factory or community in Wales without its own team. Fullback Lloyd Rowlands has been playing rugby since he was 9. Now semi-professional, the training is a little more intense. But every try takes him one step closer to the big league. Of course, rugby isn't the only way to achieve legend status here in Wales. Pontypridd is also hometown to one of the country's most famous sons, singer Sir Tom Jones. Long before he achieved global stardom, the 100 million record-selling artist worked at a glove factory in town. At home here in his family's end-of-terrace house on Laura Street, he honed his skills listening to American blues singers like Big Bill Broonzy and Mahalia Jackson, the queen of gospel. Like the voice of its most famous singer, Wales has always been a force to reckon with. In AD 43, just 10 years after the death of Jesus, the Romans invaded Britain. Within 5 years, they controlled most of the southwest. But here in Wales, the empire would struggle to overcome the fierce native tribes for another 3 decades. Relics of the Roman occupation survive to this day. Near the village of Caerleon lie the ruins of a military base once manned by 5,000 elite Roman troops. Close by are the remains of a great oval amphitheatre built around AD 90, where as many as 6,000 spectators would have witnessed brutal gladiatorial combat. The Romans would occupy Wales for over 3 centuries, from 78 AD to 383 AD. This is the first town they founded, Caerwent, near the southern city of Newport. Sections of the original 1st century wall still remain, some rising up to 17 feet high. It's one of the most perfectly preserved Roman fortifications in northern Europe. In the early 5th century, with the empire under attack by barbarian armies all over Europe, the Emperor Honorius withdrew his garrisons from Britain. And so ended Roman rule. Soon Wales would be conquered all over again, and this time it would surrender without a fight. Between the 6th and 8th centuries, the pagan tribes of Wales were converted to Christianity by missionaries from Ireland. The Age of the Saints would see monastic settlements established all over the country, first by the Irish, then by the converted Welsh. The 6th century ruin of St Non's Chapel on the west coast of Pembrokeshire is said to be the birthplace of St David, Wales's patron saint. In his time, St David would spread Christianity throughout Wales, England and Brittany in northern France. Here, half a mile from his birthplace, stands the city named in his honour, St David's, population 2,000, Britain's smallest metropolis. The city's medieval cathedral was founded on the site where St David established a monastic community. A stone set into the altar is said to have been brought back from a pilgrimage St David took to Jerusalem. Near the cathedral lie the ruins of a medieval palace built by 13th and 14th century bishops. But in the 16th century, Bishop William Barlow stripped the lead from the roof to pay for the dowries of his 5 daughters. The building fell into disrepair, never to recover. St David's Cathedral has had a tumultuous history. Extensively damaged by an earthquake in 1247, it was modified many times over the next 3 centuries and contains the tomb of Edmund Tudor, grandfather of King Henry VIII of England. Just outside St David's, entomologist and ecologist Dr. Sarah Benyon runs a farm unlike any other. In a bid to overcome a childhood phobia of insects, she immersed herself in all things creepy-crawly. The result was the Bug Farm, established in 2015 and now literally buzzing with activity. Here, guests can explore habitats swarming with insect life, visit the Bug Museum and Zoo, and learn about the farm's cutting-edge research into farmland biodiversity. They can also dine at the Grub Kitchen, Britain's first edible insect cafe. Delicacies on offer include bug burgers, mealworm hummus, and their famous cricket cookies. Local producer Gail Twitchen tends beehives at 6 locations on St David's Peninsula, including the Bug Farm. Just as the honey Gail harvests is sweetened of this peninsula's wildflower meadows, the landscape of Wales is imbued with one of the greatest legends of medieval Britain. The Great Mountain Range of Snowdonia National Park includes some of the highest peaks in Wales, including the highest of them all, Mount Snowdon. This 800-square-mile natural reserve also preserves the legend of an extraordinary mythical figure. In Welsh, the name of Mount Snowdon means the tomb of Rita Gawr, a fearsome giant supposedly slain by King Arthur. As legend has it, the giant's body lies buried under massive stones at the summit. This ridge is said to be the place where Arthur himself died, killed in battle by his own son, Mordred. Arthur's magical sword Excalibur is said to lie beneath Glaslyn Lake on the mountain's east flank, cast into the icy waters by Sir Bedivere after the king's death. Snowdon's mystical beauty attracts 500,000 visitors every year. The outlying region is home to over 28,000 people, nearly 2/3 of whom speak Welsh as their first language. There are many routes to the top of Wales's highest peak, but the most comfortable is the Snowdon Mountain Railway. In 1896, steam locomotives began taking visitors from the village of Llanberis on the 4.5-mile journey to the summit. The locomotives were built specially for the line in Switzerland, the only country at that time with the required expertise to transport people safely up and down the mountain. 3 of the original 5 locomotives are still in service today, over 120 years later. Every year, 130,000 passengers brave the vertiginous 2.5-hour climb, rewarded with spectacular views of the Welsh landscape all the way up, weather permitting. In 2009, this visitor centre opened at the summit. On a clear day, passengers alighting for a 30-minute stopover at the highest point in Wales can see all the way to Ireland. The 19th century English travel writer George Borrow once wrote, "I never saw water falling so gracefully, so much like thin, beautiful threads as here." The object of his affection was the great waterfall of Pistol Ryder in the northeast of Snowdonia. This place, where the river Afon Disgyn Fawr tumbles down a 240-foot cliff, is known as one of the 7 wonders of Wales. Pistol Ryder is not one, but 3 separate falls, each adding its own complexity to the elegance of the cascade. Where there are mountains, there are lakes, and Snowdonia has 250 of them. This one, called Llyn Padarn, is popular with kayakers and paddleboarders. Lake Bala, to the east, is the largest natural lake in Wales. Rich pickings for anglers who come here for perch, pike, trout and salmon. Barry Evans and his son Elan have fished these waters all their lives. But one fish they won't be landing today is the Gwiniad. It's an elusive species, native to Lake Bala, stranded here over 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. It lurks in the deepest reaches of the lake, far beyond the reach of rod and line. The picturesque village of Tremodog on the outskirts of Snowdonia is the home to the hostel of Snowdon Lodge. In 1888, this was the birthplace of archaeologist, soldier and writer Thomas Edward Lawrence, known to the world as Lawrence of Arabia. In his classic book, The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, Lawrence recounted his exploits in the Middle East during the First World War. During that conflict, he helped lead an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, a campaign immortalized in the classic 1962 film Lawrence of Arabia. From Wales's most colourful sun to one of its most colourful towns. Located on a private peninsula off the Snowdonia coast, the brightly coloured buildings and enchanting parks of Portmeirion were built between 1925 and 1976. This fanciful landscape, created in the style of an Italian village, was primarily designed as a tourist attraction. The entire village operates as a hotel, with guest rooms in each of its buildings. Portmeirion is perhaps best known as the filming location for the cult 1960s sci-fi series The Prisoner, about a British former secret agent who is abducted and imprisoned in a mysterious coastal resort from which he can never seem to escape. Before his death, Portmeirion's unconventional architect, Clough William Ellis, asked for his ashes to be launched over the estuary in a rocket. His last request was eventually carried out on New Year's Eve, 1998. This structure in northeast Wales might look like a bridge, but it is more than that. This is the 200-year-old waterway of Pontycustleth Aqueduct. Crossing the River Dee and rising 126 feet above it, the stone and cast iron span is an incredible feat of civil engineering that took 10 years to design and build. Completed in 1805, Pontycustleth is the longest and highest navigable aqueduct in Britain. It's 100 feet long and 5 feet deep, supported by arched iron ribs on 18 hollow masonry piers. The aqueduct was originally designed to transport coal, iron, slate and limestone. Today, it's mainly sightseers who are rewarded with incredible views across the Dee Valley. Lake Vyrnwy in North Wales. 130 years ago, this was a peaceful valley where a village once stood. Today, it's a watery playground for sports people like professional adventurer Dave Proctor, who runs an activity centre nearby. He's been sailing these waters for almost 50 years. The Great Reservoir was built in 1888 and was once the main water supply for the city of Liverpool, 80 miles to the north. Although swimming in Vyrnwy is prohibited, local Diane Thomas makes the most of the lake on her doorstep. She recently completed a triathlon here, part of which involved kayaking the full length of the lake. In the distance, what looks like a Gothic-style tower is actually an elegant water filtration system. In its day, the dam was Britain's largest and supplied power to the local area right up to the 1960s. But Lake Vyrnwy came at a cost. Flooding the valley required the sacrifice of the village of Llanwydden, whose dead were respectfully exhumed from the local cemetery and reburied further down the valley. In the lower reaches of Snowdonia National Park, the market town of Machynlleth is regarded as the ancient capital of Wales. Once the stronghold of a rebel leader, just as legendary to the Welsh as the mythical King Arthur. His name, Owen Glyndwr, the last Welshman to hold the title Prince of Wales. Glyndwr's 15th century revolt against English rule was effectively a full-scale war against the English king, Henry IV. This medieval building in the town is the original site of a parliament where Glyndwr declared his vision of an independent Welsh state. Here he was crowned Prince of Wales by his followers. When the rebellion ultimately foundered, Glyndwr went into hiding. Despite enormous rewards offered for his capture, he was never betrayed. He is said to have died in 1415, but Glyndwr is still revered as one of Wales's most heroic figures. In 1970, two young musicians came here to the 18th century cottage of Golden Hill, or Bron y Oer. They weren't just visiting, they'd come to work on one of the most famous rock albums of all time. At the time, this was the holiday home of the Plant family. Robert Plant and his bandmate Jimmy Page had just completed a long North American tour. Here, they would write and partly record Led Zeppelin III. The cottage, now in the hands of a new owner, and the landscape around it would inspire songs such as Over the Hills and Far Away, and of course, Bron y Oer. It remains a mecca for dedicated Zeppelin fans. Every year, thousands of golfers make the pilgrimage to the first course specifically designed to host the Ryder Cup. The tournament between the US and Europe is held every 2 years. This course was built for the 2010 event at a cost of over $20 million. Near the city of Newport in South Wales, it forms part of the Celtic Manor Resort, a golf, spa and hotel complex set in 2,000 acres of beautiful parkland. This 395-foot-long suspension bridge across the River Usk was specially built for the Ryder Cup. Today, even amateur golfers can pit their skills against the challenging fairways and greens of the 2010 course. The otherworldly skyline of Port Talbot could hardly offer a more striking contrast. It would inspire an American-born British director to create one of Hollywood's strangest movies. The town on Wales's south coast is home to one of the largest steel foundries in the world, employing 1 in 10 of its population. Visiting Port Talbot at sunset, director Terry Gilliam was overwhelmed by the sight of fumes and vapour rising from the cooling towers, lit by plumes of ignited waste gas. It would profoundly influence his own vision for the dystopian sci-fi classic, Brazil. And the movie connections don't end there. Port Talbot is also the hometown of 2 of Wales's most iconic actors, Sir Anthony Hopkins and Sir Richard Burton. Born Richard Jenkins at this modest terraced house in the nearby village of Pontrhy-de-Fen in 1925, Burton was the 12th of 13 children. He lived here for 2 years before the family moved to Port Talbot following the death of his mother. Years later, when Burton visited the village with his then new wife, Elizabeth Taylor, locals remember the occasion as something akin to a royal visit. The sport of lawn bowls, dating back to the 13th century, has a rich history in Wales, with hundreds of clubs across the country. Today, the Inco Vale Club, 10 miles from Port Talbot, is hosting a mixed pairs competition. Club chairman Wyndham Haynes has played the sport for more than 50 years. The goal for teams is to position their set of balls closer than those of their opponents to a small white ball called the jack. One of the club's most accomplished players, Gaynor Thomas, has won numerous titles over the years, including the National Mixed Pairs Champion. These manicured lawns are the picture of civility, a far cry from the landscapes that greeted Wales's first settlers. This evocative terrain of wild moors and grassland in northern Pembrokeshire is Preseli Hills, a national park crossed by an ancient 8-mile track known as the Golden Road. Dotted throughout the area are burial sites and ancient settlements dating back to the Stone Age. For many years, it was said that bluestones quarried here 4,500 years ago were used to build Stonehenge. In 2000, to prove the claim, a local community group attempted to move a 3-ton rock to Stonehenge by Neolithic means. When the 140-mile attempt failed, the group blamed modern health and safety obstacles that would not have stopped the original engineers. As it turned out, they were right. In 2015, a team of geologists and archaeologists confirmed that the Great Pillars were indeed quarried here at Preseli and transported east to Stonehenge. In 1066, around 4,000 years after that monumental achievement, William the Conqueror invaded Britain from what is now northern France. Within 6 years, he controlled all of England, but the fierce Welsh tribes would resist for a further 200 years. At the end of the 13th century, William's descendant, Edward I, launched a full-scale war of conquest. His goal, to place Wales firmly under English control. Harlech Castle, on a spur of rock near the Irish Sea in North Wales, is one of a ring of fortresses he built to stamp his authority on the land. In the centuries that followed, Harlech gained a reputation as a near impregnable stronghold. In the 15th century, when the houses of York and Lancaster battled for the throne of England, the castle resisted siege for 7 years. In 1642, the fortress was besieged again during the English Civil War, when the forces of the king and the parliamentary government struggled for control of Britain. After holding out for 5 years, Harlech was the last royalist castle on the British mainland to surrender to the parliamentary forces. Unlike the other castles of Edward I's Iron Ring, this one, Carnarvon, was less a defensive fortress and more an expression of English dominance. Modelled on the walls of Constantinople, the castle has a series of polygonal towers. The 10-sided Eagle Tower was once decorated with stone eagles that have since weathered away. Its fearsome gatehouses are peppered with murder holes, from where the castle's defenders poured boiling oil and water down on anyone foolhardy enough to attack. It was here in 1284 that Edward's Queen Eleanor gave birth to their first son, the very first Welsh-born but English Prince of Wales. And it was here in 1969 that the present Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, was invested by his mother, Queen Elizabeth. Northeast of Carnarvon, on a coastal ridge overlooking the River Conwy, stands what is arguably the most magnificent of Edward I's Welsh fortresses. Designed by the master architect James of St George, Conwy is defended by 8 towers and 2 fortified gateways, all of which counted for little in 1401, when during the last War of Independence, 2 Welsh rebel brothers surprised the watchmen and seized control of the castle for 3 months. They eventually surrendered in exchange for a full pardon by the king. Near the castle, attached to Conwy's town walls, is Britain's smallest house. It was inhabited from the 16th century right up to 1900. Its last tenant was a 6-foot 3-inch fisherman. Visitors can view the property, but only at ground level. The upper floor is taken up by a single bed and a small cabinet. Downstairs, there's just enough room for a stove and a seat, for one. On the north coast of Wales, a narrow 16-mile-long stretch of tidal water known as the Menai Strait separates the mainland from its largest island, Anglesey. Covering an area of 276 square miles, the island is home to around 70,000 people, most of whom are Welsh speakers. This great span linking to the mainland is the 1,400-foot-long Menai Suspension Bridge. It was designed by master engineer Thomas Telford and completed in 1826, replacing a hazardous ferry journey across the treacherous, fast-flowing waters of the strait. This ghostly collection of industrial buildings on Anglesey's north coast is the abandoned ruin of Port Wen Brickworks. Once a hive of activity, now a monument to a long-dead industry. This was where the quartzite bricks that lined the furnaces of the Victorian steel industry were made. The quartzite was crushed by workers wearing iron-covered gloves before being hand-moulded and fired in dome kilns. Finished bricks were dispatched to the forges of a new industrial age from this quay. Now crumbling into ruins like the rest of the site. weathered by sea and salt for more than a century. Anglesey is just one of over 50 islands off the Welsh coast. Many, like the tiny island of Caldey in Carmarthen Bay, were the site of early monastic settlements, remote havens of contemplation and prayer, safe from attack. Today, a small community of Cistercian Trappist monks, based here since the 1920s, continues that tradition. Although home to only around 40 permanent residents, the island issues its own stamps and has its own currency known as the dab. During the spring and summer months, the monks welcome visitors on spiritual retreat, as well as those who come to enjoy the island's rich wildlife. Caldey may be a place of the soul, but the heart of Wales lies deep below the ground. A great treasure is buried beneath the valleys of South Wales. Hundreds of feet below the ground lies one of Britain's most extensive coalfields. During the Industrial Revolution, that same coal was a vital and precious commodity. By the early 20th century, over 250,000 men were working in Wales's coal mines. This mine, called Big Pit at Blaenefon in Monmouthshire, was one of the most productive. Coal mined here fueled the steel industry, powered steamships, and fed the locomotive engines of America's Great Western Railway. Since 1983, Big Pit has been a World Heritage Site. Today, brave souls can descend 300 feet in the original pit cage to the dark coalface where miners once toiled. But there's a much darker side to Wales's mining history. This is the peaceful former mining town of Aberfan in the Taff Valley. Here at 9:15 on the morning of October the 21st, 1966, as the children of a local junior school gathered for lessons, the ground suddenly began to shake. Over many years, huge piles of mining debris had been deposited on the hillside above the village. Loosened by heavy rain, the great mass of coal, shale and water began to slide downhill, consuming everything in its path, including the school. Despite the desperate efforts of thousands of volunteers and mine workers, 116 children and 28 adults were killed. Today, the victims are remembered at a memorial garden at the cemetery where many of them are buried. With a population of nearly 250,000, Swansea is Wales's second city. A major industrial centre in the 19th century, its forges smelted so much copper, the town became known as Copperopolis. It's hard to believe that less than 80 years ago, much of this city lay in ruins. Over the course of 3 nights in 1941, German long-range bombers wiped out entire streets, turning the city centre into a blazing inferno. Rebuilt and expanded in the years that followed, today the town's centrepiece is the residential tower of Meridian Quay, Wales's tallest building. Down on the beach, the UK's largest beach yoga class is underway, led by Annapurna Helen Wilson. These weekly summer sessions are open to all and attract dozens of locals, calming bodies and minds as they breathe the sea air flowing in from Swansea Bay. Of course, yoga is not for everyone. Mountain biker Simon Wilson gets all the fresh air he needs speeding along sections of the Wales Coast Path. Opened in 2012, it was the first of its kind in the world. Following the entire Welsh coastline, It extends over 880 miles through breathtaking scenery, skirting a series of hair-raising sheer drops. The fossil-rich limestone cliffs of Nash Point in the Vale of Glamorgan mark a spectacular end to Simon's journey. A chance to catch his breath and take in the stunning view. About 60 miles inland, hidden in the quiet Welsh countryside, a collection of old farm buildings give little hint of their pivotal role in the history of rock music. This is Rockfield Studios, the world's first residential recording facility. For years, artists from Motorhead to the Pixies and Coldplay have come here to live, write and record. The facility has two studios, the Coach House, where in 1996 Oasis recorded their iconic album What's the Story, Morning Glory, and the Quadrangle Studio, where in 1975 Queen recorded one of the greatest rock anthems of all time, Bohemian Rhapsody. If the legendary musicians who came here ever tired of Rockfield's peaceful charms, they had only to venture 10 miles west to find inspiration. The extraordinary landscape of the Brecon Beacons has inspired many things over the years, not least the misty mountains of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Extending east to west over 500 square miles, the region includes several mountain ranges, but is known by the chain of 6 peaks at its centre, dominated by the brooding silhouette of Pen y Fan. The beacons were named after the ancient practice of lighting signal fires on the mountaintops to warn of invasion, and their role in defence of the realm continues to this day. For more than a century, these remote and exposed uplands have been a training ground for British Special Forces. This is the fishing village of Larne in Carmarthenshire, west of the Brecon Beacons. Once home to Wales's greatest poet, Dylan Thomas, author of Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. Born in Swansea, Thomas first came to fame with the publication in 1934 of the poem Light Breaks Where No Sun Shines. He spent most of his life in Larne, and his last 4 years at this boathouse overlooking the Taff estuary, struggling with the alcoholism that would destroy his health. Here he wrote his famous radio play Under Milk Wood, whose fictional town of Clarigob was based on Larne. After Thomas died at New York's historic Chelsea Hotel in 1953 at the age of 39, his remains were brought home to his beloved Larne. Another of Wales's great literary heroes was the renowned children's writer Roald Dahl. The author of James and the Giant Peach, Matilda, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was born at this house in the North Cardiff suburb of Llandaff in 1916. His parents were among the immigrants from Norway who settled in Cardiff during the 19th century, and Dahl's first language was Norwegian. Growing up in Llandaff greatly influenced Dahl. As a student at the town's cathedral school, he and 4 classmates were punished for placing a dead mouse in a jar of gobstoppers to torment the local sweet shop owner, Mrs. Pratchett. With typical literary flair, Dahl called it the Great Mouse Plot of 1924. In 2017, Cardiff held a 3-day festival called City of the Unexpected, celebrating the centenary of the author's birth. A few miles north of Cardiff, a castle that would grace any children's story towers above the village of Tongwyn Lais. This is Red Castle, or as it's known in Welsh, Castell Coch. It was built for the owner of Cardiff Castle, William Crichton Stuart, as a rural retreat, but he rarely used it. Although he died before its completion in 1891, the eccentric architect James Burgess recreated an authentic medieval fortress with 3 dramatic stone towers and a formidable gatehouse complete with drawbridge. English architectural historian Joseph Mondaunt Crook described it as the learned dream world of a great patron and his favourite architect, a fairy tale castle which seems almost to have materialised from the margins of a medieval manuscript. Cardiff may be Wales's first city, but the mainly Welsh-speaking town of Aberystwyth is regarded as its cultural capital. This isolated town on the country's west coast became a popular Victorian seaside resort after it was connected to the rest of the country by rail in the 19th century. The tourism boom saw the building of fine hotels and guest houses, as well as the elegant seafront homes that remain one of Aberystwyth's most distinctive features. The town's mile-long promenade stretches from the harbour to the headland of Constitution Hill, where a cable-drawn railway ascends to the summit. A Victorian theme park was built here in 1896, with arcades, a restaurant at the foot of the hill, and a park at the top. The railway was originally powered by water weights, then electrified in 1921. The tilted carriages are designed to keep passengers in an upright position as they make the 45-degree climb. Aberystwyth came to even further prominence when Wales' first university was established here. This building welcomed its first 26 students in 1872 and soon became known as the People's University. On the far side of the country, near the southeastern border with England, lie the ruins of an earlier centre of culture and learning. Tintern Abbey was founded in 1131 on the banks of the River Wye by monks of the Cistercian order. Over 400 years later, when Henry VIII broke with the Roman Catholic Church and ordered the dissolution of the monasteries, Tintern slowly fell into a state of decay. What remains is still an awe-inspiring sight. The decorated Gothic architecture of its great church, elegantly expressed in its elaborate arched windows. This abbey was painted by the great English masters Gainsborough and Turner, and would also fire the imagination of poets, from Wordsworth to Tennyson. As the 19th century Scottish writer Catherine Sinclair once wrote, "Descriptions of Tintern Abbey should be written on ivy leaves and with a poet's pen. For no other do justice to the air of solemn grandeur and religious melancholy reigning within its delicate cloisters." In the far northeast of Wales stands a very different cathedral of stone, attracting climbers keen to pit their skills against its angular rock faces. In 1995, Mark Reeves came to this area to study and never left. He has since established himself as a climbing coach and mountaineering instructor. When he's not scaling Dinorwic Quarry's dramatic slate cliffs, he writes rock climbing guides to North Wales and beyond. Slate from these quarries once roofed the houses of the world. During the late 19th century, a workforce of over 3,000 laboured here, gangs of men blasting the rock before splitting it with hammer and chisel. It was dangerous work, even more deadly than mining. Those lucky enough not to be killed often had their lungs destroyed by slate dust. The tram lines used to transport the slate still run like veins through the rock. The mine closed in 1969, leaving a landscape that bears the legacy of its industrial past with pride. The bedrock of a nation defined by the character of its people. Timeless, monumental, indomitable. Wales.